Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today we're going to be jumping into the first computing competitive in a hot minute. We're going to be taking a look at the last EU Ignition Series event, the LVL Clash 2. Let's hop right in. As I just mentioned, the LVL Clash 2 was the last European Ignition Series event, and it was the first to feature the new agent Killjoy. A lot of people had mixed expectations coming into this Ignition Series event, with G2 obviously still being the juggernaut that they are across the European scene, but with new challengers arising in the form of FPX, as well as some new upstarts like Angry Titans entering the scene. The event played off across 2 days with a relatively atypical group stage format. As opposed to the round-robin groups that we've come to expect from Ignition Series events, the LVL Clash 2 actually featured bracketed group stages. This will come into play a little bit later when we look at agent pick rates, because what this means is that the winningest teams in groups just simply played significantly less matches. Moving into spoilers, plug your ears if you don't want to hear them. The semifinals panned out with Ninjas in Pajamas facing off against Bonk, and G2 Esports facing off against FunPlus Phoenix. Bonk was the first of the two grand finalists, taking down NiP 2-1, and in what many coaches, fans, and analysts dubbed the unofficial final, G2 Esports took down FPX in a 2-0. In the grand final proper, G2 continued to establish that they are the most dominant team in European Valorant with a swift 2-0 over Bonk. With all of that background information out of the way, let's hop right into map stats. Taking a look at map play rates, we have a phenomenon developing that's pretty interesting. We see a large movement back towards teams favoring Bind that is a lot more similar to what we saw in early beta. In the meantime, Haven has fallen significantly out of favor, which is again a very stark contrast to what we've seen most recently out of both Europe and North America. Overall, the way the stats fell was Ascent at 31%, Bind at 37%, Haven at 17%, and Split coming up the back at 14%. In terms of map skew, this is where things get really exciting for me personally, because we have a brand new circumstance when taking a look at Bind, which has increased so dramatically in popularity recently. As the play rate is spiking to numbers we haven't seen since the third week of beta, Bind has also seen a complete inversion in the skew of the map. Up until even patch 1.05, Bind had consistently shown a 47-53 defensive skew, and in this competition, we're seeing that literally reverse, now boasting a 53-47. In the meantime, the rest of the maps are really showing what we have typically expected from them, a 45-55 on Ascent, and while they do par the traditional skews on Haven and Split, they're quite a bit more exaggerated than we've seen in the past. Haven now showing a very strong offensive bias of 57-43, and Split showing an absurd defensive bias of 38-62. Before we jump into agent pick and win rates, I wanted to put a pretty strong disclaimer on this that I mentioned briefly during that intro segment, and that's that because of the way that the group stages were conducted in this tournament, these numbers are going to be quite a bit skewed. You had scenarios where if a team was succeeding and doing notably well, they were playing less games and thus contributing in a less significant way to these statistics. You had scenarios where a team like FPX was winning out of their group and thus played only 2 matches, where comparatively, 2 teams that were less successful in that group, BBL and Angry Titans, played 3 games apiece. That will ultimately skew these statistics and create a scenario where they're not necessarily going to be as telling of the overall metagame as we would want them to be otherwise. So keep that in the back of your mind as we jump through all of this. Looking first at pick rates, we have Omen atop the leaderboard where he has been quite frequently as of late, with a 93% pick rate. I've talked about Omen what feels like ad nauseum, so I won't go super in depth with it, but I think that Omen's flexibility as a controller, where he can also use Paranoia and play a bit of a pseudo entry role, he really has just sort of taken over Brimstone's spot as the premier smoker that people tend to lean into. Coming up second on the leaderboard is quite a surprise. We have Sova coming in at 83%. Sova's been super high on my agent power rankings since very early on in beta, and I think that as people have played the game more and more, and come to appreciate just how strong Recon Dart is. He's gone up in value gradually. I think that this number is pretty close to where I think he will be until we have other information-oriented agents added to the game. After him, we have Sage, showing the play rate that we've sort of come to expect from her in Europe at least, with teams like Fabrican sort of leading the charge with the Sageless metagame. Around 75% is where we've seen her for the last couple Ignition Series events. Next up, we have Cypher, also floating in the 75-76% play rate arena. This is a pretty significant fall from grace from him. In more recent Ignition Series events, we've seen him in the lower to mid-90s, so pretty dramatic. This is obviously going to be directly linked to the fact that Killjoy was released, and while, if you've seen my recent content, my personal take on Killjoy was that she isn't a Cypher replacement, she's a better Cypher partner, it seems that there are a couple teams who believe that she is an adequate Cypher replacement. We'll touch on this a little bit more when we get to compositions, and take a dive into whether that assessment is more correct or whether or not I was on the right track. Next up, we have Jet at a 61% play rate. There's been a pretty consistent upward trend for Jet as of recent, but more so in North America than in EU. And that's why we see her being just a tad lower in Europe here than she would have been on a global basis during the current patch. In standard EU fashion, we now have Raze showing up at 53% play rate, quite a bit higher than the global norm. Tailing her, we have Killjoy, who actually saw significantly more play here than in the global metagame as of right now. A little footnote on this one for those of you worried about the validity of the statistic. When it comes to the current patch global stat, this is adjusted to only include tournaments where Killjoy was not global banned, which is only going to be a couple of tournaments from the Asian region, a couple tournaments from Latin America, and the most recent Ignition Series events from North America and Europe. Next up, we have Breach at a 10% play rate. This is more or less where we expect him to be, as of recent at least. Obviously a far cry from where he was in the past, but there's a little side note I want to include here. If you look by the numbers at who the middle of the pack is in this list of agents, you have the top four, Omen, Sova, Sage, Cypher. You have the middle four of Jet, Raze, Killjoy, Breach, and then the bottom four of Brimstone, Phoenix, Viper, and Reyna. So Breach technically qualifies as a middle of the pack agent, and he's only showing a 10% play rate. That should say to you, if you're looking at this in terms of the statistics and deep analysis, that there is an absurd concentration on those top agents in this listing. The fact that you can be, quote, middle of the pack and only have a 10% play rate shows that the top of the pack is overwhelmingly dominant, and we're going to touch on that a bit more when we hit compositions, because there is a certain archetype that has just dominated this region in terms of prevalence. Next up, we have Brimstone at only 9% play. This is actually becoming increasingly common in Europe, but is still a fairly stark contrast to what we see in North America. There are a couple teams in NA that still play Breach on the regular, where in EU that list is very, very short, FPX being basically the sole reason that Brimstone is on this list, but it's something to keep an eye on for sure as we move forward. Next up, we have Phoenix at a shocking 3% play rate. This is obviously going to be a huge nosedive from where he's at in the global meta, and that's predominantly driven by the fact that Korea and North American play the hell out of this agent. For whatever reason, even though he's incredibly prevalent in those regions, EU's been very, very hesitant to pull him out, despite the fact that it's widely considered a fairly strong answer to the operator meta. This is further confounded by the fact that EU's top comp doesn't really have answers to the operator meta inbuilt itself. They don't run double controller, and clearly by the lack of Phoenix and low prevalence of Breach, they're not running significant flashes either. Right now, it feels almost as if EU's de facto answer to the operator meta is to just sling it right back at them and try to outgun them doing the same thing. This overarching regional meta attribute actually goes back and can explain a bit the increasingly dramatic skews that we're seeing on maps like Split and Haven. If we accept the overarching premise that both teams are likely to play the same composition and a roughly similar playstyle, then the inherent map characteristics that favor one side over the other are going to more consistently prove that result. You don't have confounding elements like variations in composition that will otherwise disturb the map imbalance. But I digress. Next up, we have Viper at not 0%. All jokes aside, I'm really glad to see Viper coming out of sort of an era of literally 0% play rate and especially seeing her come out in the form that we saw her. Bonk was playing Viper on split really through the entire bracket, and they even pulled it out in the grand finals against G2 on what would end up being the closest map of that series. Last up, we have Reyna at only a 1.4% play rate, and interestingly, I'm actually going to blame this on that group stage format that I mentioned earlier. The team that was most likely to play Reyna repeatedly throughout the bracket, Team Liquid, went and lost out of their group basically immediately, and so Reyna's play rates are deflated. If TL had even made it further into their group, then Reyna would be in the same 2.9% bracket that Phoenix and Viper are in, and if TL had made it where many people expected them to go, at least to the playoff semifinals, you'd see Reyna at a play rate closer to Breach's. Just another highlight of the considerations we should have in the back of our minds as we go through these numbers. Let's hop over to Win. Kicking us off at the top of the totem pole, we have Breach. Really surprising to see him here, but also not surprising at all if you know who he was played by. He only had a roughly 10% play rate, and he was almost exclusively played by FPX. FPX obviously finding extreme success in this tournament, skewing his win rate up quite significantly. And the exact same thing actually applies to Brimstone, the second on the list at 57%. Angel played Brim repeatedly for FPX, and due to their results, the win rate is going to be extremely high here. Simultaneously, surprisingly and unsurprisingly, we have Killjoy at third on the list with roughly 54%. This, like the top two slots, I'm going to primarily attribute to the teams that were playing it, not the strength of the agent itself. With Ninjas in Pajamas basically one-tricking a Killjoy comp and G2 pulling it out quite frequently, I think that Killjoy's win rate is a little bit artificially inflated here. Next up on the list, we have Raze coming in at just shy of 52%. An EU classic that we should all recognize and respect at this point. Coming in the fifth slot, we surprisingly see Phoenix, which goes back to the commentary I was just having about his confusingly low play rate. Despite showing up only 3% of the time, his win rate is closer to that we see in North America, hinting that his ability to shut down the operator meta and really sort of establish sightlines is probably far more universal than his pick rate would otherwise insinuate. Below him, we have Sova, who honestly should be nicknamed Mr. Consistent. I think that Sova's win rate hasn't gone below 50% or above 52% since beta for more than like 1 or 2 days at a time. This is where Sova has basically always been. Dead at the 50% mark, we have Viper. Below her, we have a string of agents that I am very shocked to see this low. We have Jet, Omen, Sage, and Cypher, which, if you recall, is 4 of the 5 most played agents of the tournament. They're all at notably sub 50% win rates. This, to me, is something very, very compelling and is the signaling of the beginning of a new era in Valorant strategy. That might sound a little hyperbolic, but when you sort of logically reason your way through it, you'll understand a little bit more why I say that. For what is really the first time in all of Valorant esports competitive history, we have a situation where the components of the most prevalent composition are also some of the most poorly performing agents in the game. What this is going to generally point towards is the fact that the teams that were running these cookie-cutter generic compositions that were highly recurring were unable to find success against teams that were running either more finely tuned niche compositions or gimmicky compositions that were tailored to either the map that was being played or for counter strats specific to the team that they were facing. Coaches and analysts who see these statistics should look at this result, and it should basically be a slap in the face to them saying that you no longer have an option, you cannot play the quote-unquote standard meta, you need to be innovating. Last on the list, and following the exact same narrative as applied to her play rates, we have Reyna, who was literally only pulled out by Team Liquid. Given Team Liquid's result, Reyna's win rate is trash. Now getting into my bread and butter, the compositions, I'm going to reapply the same caveat as has been applied basically this entire video, that the group stage format of this tournament made that compositional statistics are a little bit wacky. The most played compositions are going to be the ones that were played by the teams that lost and thus had to play more rounds during the group stage. At any rate, we have here the top 3 most played compositions of the event, and now we see very, very clearly why the top 5 most played agents were who they were. The dark web compositional core of Cypher, Omen, Sage, and Sova is continuing to do exactly what I predicted it to do around a month ago now, which is dominate the global meta landscape. Looking at the play rate statistics, you see that the topmost composition, Dark Web plus Raze, accounted for almost 19% of all compositions played, and Dark Web plus Jet, the second most played, accounted for almost 17%. The third most played composition, while not a true Dark Web core due to the absence of Sage, still held 3 of the 4 components and instead ran both of the plus ones from the first and second most played compositions, instead running Cypher, Omen, Sova, and then adding in both Raze and Jet. As can be clearly seen, this archetype still has a death grip on the European metagame, with well over 30% of all compositions played being allocated to it, and even beyond that, significantly more being added if you're willing to look at minor permutations. In spite of its overwhelming metagame presence, its success is far more of a mixed bag. Going back to the commentary I just made about compositional variety and the need for innovation, the teams that were running these dark web comps were struggling. Big time. The most played comp, Dark Web plus Raze, saw only a 46% win rate, and the Dark Web variant with Jet only 44%. In fact, the third composition, which was a slight innovation away from the Dark Web core, immediately saw significantly better results with a 55% win rate. To give credit where due to the teams that were willing to break that mold, we see teams that should be very familiar if you follow my commentaries on innovative teams. We have the newcomers of Angry Titans as well as mainstays in Bonk. Something obviously worth mentioning here though is that there are a lot of teams and agents conspicuously missing. We don't see FPX, we don't see G2 Esports, and we don't see Killjoy. To take a look at those more particularly, I want to touch on a couple more things. In the case of Fun Plus Phoenix, they were touted by many, including myself, the team that is most likely to dethrone G2 in the near future. While they played a variety of compositions, the one I'm most interested in highlighting is the one that drove both Breach and Brimstone to the top of the win percent bracket. This composition of Breach, Brimstone, Cypher, Raze, Sova is an adaptation of a mainstay archetype that we've talked about numerous times before, Shock and Awe. Instead of running the traditional core of Brimstone, Sage, Raze, and Sova, they instead drop the Sage and opt for Cypher and Breach, ultimately creating a compositional amalgam of the classic common core with that Shock and Awe. It's by no coincidence that this innovative composition ended up also being the winningest comp that we saw throughout the entirety of the tournament, with almost 62%. While this composition was only played on Bind, it ultimately plays exactly into the story that I am now telling, where teams are creating compositions and overall playstyles that are more adapted to maps and specific teams than a generic cookie-cutter overarching meta. And in the end, they're finding extreme success because of it. Moving on to the last thing I wanted to touch on, it's Killjoy. With this being her first competition available in Europe, I would be remiss not to talk about her at least a little bit. Sadly, however, the compositions we find her in are anything but inspiring. If we copy-paste Cypher over Killjoy here, it is literally just the second and third most played compositions of the tournament. So, people are doing exactly what I advised against, which is running Killjoy as a Cypher replacement, not as a Cypher partner. And unsurprisingly given that, the results are an extremely mixed bag. In one case, you have a composition with a mere 48% win rate, something that no one would want to actively opt into, and another at 55.2%. You may be saying, oh, well that 55.2% is extremely fantastic, obviously Killjoy could be a Cypher replacement and find decent success. To that, my answer would be that you're looking at the number and not the context. To give you that context, this winninger version of a Killjoy composition was played significantly less than the other, and was the iteration that was played by G2. G2, if I'm being fully honest, did not play Killjoy as Killjoy. It was almost picked purely out of disrespect, and was run as if it was a generic agent, not a Killjoy. There was very little tactical use of abilities, and was really just pressing W in the majority of the games. The success of this composition wasn't born out of creative use of Killjoy. It was born out of the fact that G2 can still basically walk their way through any team in the European region regardless of strategy. When Killjoy was being played as a Cypher replacement by anyone that wasn't the uncontested best team in the region, it was underperforming. And that brings us to the end of not only the LVL Clash 2, but of all of Europe's Ignition series. I'm incredibly excited to see where Valorant esports in Europe are headed next, but this was quite a way to send them off. I think that it's an interesting pivot point that hopefully everyone's taking note of. I don't care if you're a coach, an analyst, a player, a casual viewer, a diehard fan. One of the things that we should all be taking away from this event and the Ignition series as a whole is that we have made significant strategic progress as a game. We went through multiple eras of single archetypal compositions absolutely dominating the metagame to now be at a point where teams that are willing to break that mold and innovate, like FPX and Bonk, are challenging even the undisputed juggernauts of their regions. If you are moving forward as a professional team, as a coach, as an analyst, it is now the time to innovate. You can no longer sit on your laurels and run the same composition that everyone else in your region is running. If you do, an FPX or a Bonk is going to come up from behind and take away your trophy someday. I'm incredibly excited to see where this goes from here. Hope that you guys are enjoying this content. Obviously, I'm going to keep it going as much as I possibly can. Computing competitives might get a little bit sparse here as we wait for the next announcement post-Ignition series, but we've got a few more coming, obviously, with the event in North America finishing up today as well. That will be coming out within really just the next 24 to 48 hours after this. Per the usual, if you guys are enjoying my content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. And if you're really enjoying things, you can find me across the interwebs, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, all at AnderzzTV. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.